Think your favorite war movie shows you real combat. It doesn't. On a real battlefield in history, most of us wouldn't last 5 minutes. That's not an insult to courage, it's simply a fact. The world of war looked nothing like the version handed to us by Hollywood. On screen, you see slow-motion charges, one-man duels, soldiers locked in perfect choreography, and heroes turning the tide with a single act. Reality was slower, grittier, stranger, and far more dependent on details that a movie camera could never capture. Supplies, formations, endurance, and fear. The things that truly decided life and death weren't sword tricks or inspiring speeches. They were the cracks in human nerves, the strength of discipline, and the ability to keep going when your body begged you to stop. Imagine standing in a long line of soldiers, shield pressed into your arm so heavily you feel your muscles screaming after minutes, not hours. Your spear points forward, not for dueling, but to add to a wall of points extending across the field. Your neighbor's shield overlaps yours, so close you can feel his breath. This wasn't chaos. This was the Greek phalanx, one of the most disciplined machines of war the ancient world knew. It looked nothing like the scattered millies you see in movies. The front rank bristled with spearheads while the rows behind pressed forward, driving their weight like a single body. There was no dancing, no flipping, no room for glory. If you stood in the front, your vision was blocked by bronze. The air was thick with dust, the noise deafening. You didn't fight alone, you survived by not breaking the wall. Victory didn't always come from stabbing an enemy. More often it came when one side finally cracked, when fear broke their formation, when men chose to step back instead of forward. Whole battles could end not with slaughter but with one side running while the other pressed forward. That's how fragile war really was. Human willpower mattered more than weapons. Centuries later, the same pattern repeated on medieval fields, where Hollywood would have you believe knights galloped like lone champions with swords drawn. In truth, a cavalry charge was one of the most calculated moves in warfare. Imagine hundreds of armored horses, each weighing over a ton, thundering together in a line. The ground shook, the noise was overwhelming, but this was no reckless stampede. Commanders timed it with precision. Archers softened the enemy first, infantry harassed weak points, and only when the line was unstable did the cavalry strike. The charge wasn't aimed at everyone, it was aimed at a gap. Knights rode tight, shoulder to shoulder. A rider who broke formation wasn't a hero, he was dead. Movies leave out that discipline mattered more than daring. Even the famous longbowmen weren't lone warriors picking targets like snipers. They fired in waves, their arrows darkening the sky in terrifying clouds. Think of thousands of shafts whistling down together, rattling against shields, cutting through armor at close range. English soldiers at Agincourt planted sharpened stakes in the mud, forcing French cavalry to impale themselves before they ever reached the line. This wasn't cinematic, it was practical field engineering. The real victories of the Middle Ages weren't made in glorious charges, but in muddy trenches, in hours of holding steady under hunger and rain. And most wars weren't even decided on the battlefield at all. They were decided in sieges. Imagine waiting for months outside stone walls, digging trenches, building towers, starving an enemy into surrender while disease ate through your own camp. Most soldiers in the Middle Ages died not in sudden clashes, but slowly, from fever, hunger, or infection. A commander who could feed his men and keep them disciplined often won without needing to risk a pitched battle. Logistics mattered more than swordplay. Armies marched on bread, water, and supply wagons, not speeches. If a general failed to secure food or protect roads, his force dissolved before fighting began. History is filled with campaigns that collapsed because wagons broke, rivers flooded, or winters froze men in their tents. Napoleon's march into Russia is a famous case not defeated by muskets, but by hunger and cold. Even in earlier centuries, the same principle applied. Terrain and weather decided more wars than sword or arrow. A sudden storm, a field turned to mud, or a river that couldn't be crossed at the right time could undo months of planning. Morale was just as decisive. Soldiers weren't machines, they were people with limits. Fear spread quickly. If one unit broke and ran, others followed. Whole armies disintegrated without huge losses simply because men lost faith in their leaders or in survival. Many great commanders weren't remembered for their sword arms, but for their ability to hold their men together when panic threatened to spread. The difference between victory and disaster could be a single moment when one side decided to keep standing while the other gave up. Then, there is the myth of accuracy. In movies, every shot lands, every arrow finds its mark, every musket ball seems to kill on impact. Real battle was far different. In World War II, studies showed that only about a fifth of infantrymen fired their rifles at all in combat, and of those who did, most missed under stress. If modern soldiers struggled with accuracy, imagine the reality of ancient archers aiming without sights, through dust and chaos, against moving masses of men. Precision wasn't the goal. What mattered was volume, volleys of arrows or bolts landing like storms, not to kill one man but to break the confidence of many. Arrows that wounded or killed often did so by chance. The real purpose was psychological, not surgical. And this leads to what Hollywood avoids most of all: the psychology of combat. Human beings are not naturally wired to kill. Most hesitate, freeze, or fire blindly rather than strike with precision. Armies across history drilled endlessly to override this instinct, teaching men to act without thinking, to follow orders even when terror screamed at them to run. But fear always lingered. Imagine the noise: thousands shouting, metal clashing, horses screaming, smoke choking the air, the cries of the wounded echoing around you. Add hunger, exhaustion, cold or heat, and you have conditions that broke even the bravest. Heroes weren't the ones without fear. They were the ones who managed to keep moving in spite of it. The weapons themselves were different from the myths. Swords, the iconic movie favorite, were expensive, rare, and mostly symbols of wealth. The common soldier carried what he could: spears, axes, wooden clubs, even sharpened farm tools. These were practical, not cinematic. Fighting techniques were plain thrust, push, trip, smash. Surviving manuals from the Middle Ages show how combat actually worked. Disarming, grappling, striking with the pommel of the sword, not spinning in elaborate dances. They were quick, efficient moves meant to end fights fast, not entertain audiences. Armor, too, was misunderstood. Most men wore padded cloth or bits of iron stitched into leather. Full-plate armor, nearly invulnerable to cuts, belonged to the rich elite. Even then, armor was not magic. It stopped blades but not the crushing force of maces or hammers, and it was exhausting to wear for long. Real combat was messy, unpredictable, and human. Disease, weather, and supply chains shaped outcomes as much as bravery. The men who survived weren't always the best. They were often the luckiest. Recognizing this doesn't reduce their sacrifice. It makes it clearer. It reminds us that war wasn't about cinematic glory, but about endurance and survival in the harshest conditions. The truth about historical warfare is that it repeated over and over as one of humanity's greatest tragedies. Generations marched, fought, and suffered, leaving behind lessons that movies polish into spectacle. But understanding the reality makes their endurance more meaningful. It helps us see why glorifying war hides more than it reveals, and why the true story lies not in the hero's duel, but in the human struggle against fear, hunger, and exhaustion. If this opened your eyes to how far Hollywood's version strays from history, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the myths and realities that shaped the world. And if you want to see what daily life in the Middle Ages really looked like, far from castles, crowns, and glory, you'll want to watch our next video.